Hey, Dr. Mehler, coming at you with a new edition of More Bad News. But it's Sunday, April 24th. It's the last day of Passover, and I thought that I would uh, share with you a little piece that I have shared around my Passover table for the past few years on the historicity, the historical reality behind the Passover story. The Passover story is about the Exodus from Egypt. To what extent is that reality? Did it really happen? Was there an Exodus? So I will start that in just a minute. Here it is. Okay, so I wanted to first share with you, this is the Haggadah. It's the most popular Haggadah around. It's the Manischewitz, the Maxwell House Coffee Haggadah. They started it off as an advertising campaign, and they printed 50 million copies of it over the years, and it's given away in Jewish neighborhoods in the supermarkets. There'll just be a kiosk with you take as many as you want and they're free. At the end of Passover, we also read the Song of Songs, and this is the one I would recommend, Ariel and Hannah Bloch. They're wonderful. It's incredible scholarship and fabulous translation of this unique biblical book. It doesn't mention God at all. These are poems describing the love between a young boy and young girl, and the center of attention is the girl who is very assertive. And it's clearly that they're not married because they meet at night and separate in the day, and all kinds of adventures happen to them. But one wonders how it ended up becoming part of the biblical canon. And there's a famous statement by Rabbi Akiva, who said that there was no debate about this, because Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, was the Holy of Holies. It was the essence of holiness. And all I can think about is that the poetry was just so magnificently beautiful that he couldn't see it being discarded. So it was part of the biblical canon. Two books in the biblical canon that don't mention God and are kind of very strange. But if you take a look at the biblical canon, you realize very quickly that it's a very diverse library of compositions by diverse authors with very diverse perspectives on life and philosophy and everything. So with that, let me go and into the matter at hand. So first, there is no direct evidence for the story of the Exodus in external sources outside the Bible, but there is indirect evidence. We have a victory hymn that's inscribed on a stele, which was erected by the Pharaoh Merneptah in the year 1204 BCE. It's a victory hymn in which he boasts of his victory over various groups in Canaan, and one of the groups that he claims to have defeated is Israel. And this is the earliest known reference outside of the Bible to Israel. It suggests that a people known as Israel was indeed in the land of Canaan by the end of the 13th century BCE. Whether they arrived there after an exodus from Egypt is not indicated. The source doesn't tell us that, and there's no archaeological evidence of a large group of people entering the land of Canaan at any time that the Exodus could reasonably have been dated to. In other words, the Exodus purports to be a story of a large number of people leaving Egypt and entering the land of Israel, Canaan. If that happened, there would be evidence of it, left over archaeological evidence, and there is none. Nevertheless, If we take the date 1204 BC and suppose that it took about a generation to enter the land, and if we put 20 years in for actually arriving and settling in the land, that takes us to 1225. And if we assume 40 years of wandering, that takes us to 1265 as a date for the Exodus. And 1265 is the 18th dynasty's most illustrious pharaoh, Ramses II, occupied the throne, and he's famous for his building projects. Now, according to the biblical record, the Hebrews were set to work on urban building projects in the Delta region at the north part of the Nile in the cities of Pithom and Ramses. The Bible states that Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. So if we add that, then we would have their descent into Egypt, Joseph and the other sons of Jacob, around 1700. And there's a certain appeal to that scenario because in the 1720s, Egypt was invaded and conquered by a Semitic people known as the Hyksos. They established a dynasty of Semitic rulers. They were centered in the north of Egypt in the area known as Goshen. So it's possible that the pharaohs of the Hyksos dynasty might have favored other Semites. They might have allowed them to enter in times of famine and dwell in the land of Goshen, where the Bible says the Israelites lived. It is also less surprising that Joseph, a Semite, might rise to a very high position in the Egyptian government, which was a government of Semites. In the 16th century, the native Egyptians who were suffering under the humiliating rule of the Hyksos succeeded in rising up and driving them out and reestablishing a native Egyptian dynasty. Some scholars have speculated that this is the historical reality behind the statement in Exodus 1:18 that a new pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph and didn't appreciate what he and his family had done for Egypt, and they began to oppress the Hebrews. The establishment of a new native Egyptian dynasty might well have led to the enslavement of the remaining Semites, or at least mistreatment of them. It all seems to fit. But there's a problem with the theory. The Bible itself contains very contradictory statements regarding the length of Israel's stay in Egypt. So Exodus 6:16 to 20 says that the Israelites were there for only 4 generations, maybe 80 years, from Levi to Moses. Levi was the great-grandfather of Moses. So that's only 4 generations, which would mean that the arrival in Egypt is a long time after the Hyksos. And we don't even know whether there was a migration in the Hyksos period. So we have really only a hypothesis with no evidence to support it. The 430-year number is also an ideal number. It places the Exodus 480 years before Solomon's building of the temple, and 480 is a multiple of 12, and the Bible really likes multiples of 12. So it's a kind of number that crops up in chronologies in the Bible all the time, and it makes it kind of a suspect. So the Hyksos theory is really not well supported. Still, there's some very interesting circumstantial evidence for Semites engaged in building projects in the 13th century. However, and wherever, whenever they might have gotten to Egypt, we do know archaeologically that the fortified city of Ramses, perhaps the biblical Pithom, was rebuilt in the 13th century on the site of the Hyksos capital in the area of Goshen. We know that the Egyptian officials allowed hungry nomads into the Delta region for food. We have Egyptian records of this, and the Semitic slaves are well attested to in Egypt at this time, the end of the 13th century. We know that people called the Hapiru or Apiru lived there, and some suggest that a connection to Hebrew. We know that the Apiru worked in the building of the capital cities. Other scholars deny that there is a connection between Hebrew and Apiru. One 13th century papyrus describes Egypt's tight control of their border areas, and another reports on Egyptian officials pursuing runaway slaves. Obviously, this happened from time to time, the slaves escaping into the desert, pursued by Egyptian chariots. The Exodus story also contains many Egyptian elements. The names Moses, Aaron, and Pinchas are all Egyptian names. None of this, of course, corroborates the specific details of the biblical story. There's no Egyptian record of the biblical Moses. There's no record of plagues. There's no record of the defeat of the Pharaoh's army. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, and some scholars think that this lends plausibility to a story of slaves working on building projects who escaped from Egypt at this time. And if there's any historical basis to the Exodus, then the most plausible time, the most plausible backdrop would be the 13th century BCE. Some scholars assume that there's a historical memory behind the elaborate and dramatic story of the miraculous redemption by God. Why would you invent a story of a national hero who's entirely Egyptian and his name is Egyptian? Why would you invent a myth of origins in which your ancestors were slaves? In the end, we're dealing here with sacred history. We're dealing with a highly embellished and theologically interpreted myth of origins for a nation. So much more important than the historical verifiability is the conviction of the ancient Israelites who received and venerated these traditions and developed them and embellished on them, that God had once acted on their behalf, rescuing them from bondage and binding them to him in an eternal covenant. So we're not dealing with history as we conceive it. We are dealing with a sacred history, a theologically constructed myth of origins, which is absolutely central to the people of Israel. It was this sacred history that justified and rationalized the sacrificial system. It was because of this which God did for us, the killing of the firstborn of Egypt, that we were obliged to offer our firstborn and redeem our firstborn sons. It was because of this that we were commanded to bind tefillin on our arms and on our heads. It was in memory of the Exodus that we sanctified the Sabbath. It was because we were once oppressed and slaves in the land of Egypt that we were commanded to ethical behavior regarding strangers in our midst. Indeed, Judaism as a theological system rests squarely on the Exodus. And it really doesn't matter if the story represents a historical reality. The story is a historical reality. Many argue, and I believe it is reasonable argument, that there is some historical memory here, that there's some fragment, that fragments of the story come from slaves who escaped from Egypt, perhaps individuals or small groups. The Red Sea might not have parted, but Egyptian chariots might have gotten bogged down in the Sea of Reeds, and that grew out in large wetlands surrounding the capital and would have offered escaping runaways refuge from the chariots. So perhaps there is some memory here, but the account that we have is not memory, it is sacred history. Does that matter? The Exodus is one of the oldest stories in Western literature, and certainly one of the most influential. On Passover, Jews reenact this sacred history that has united us for over 3,000 years. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm gonna send that over to Isaac to get posted.